The Xbox 360 era was a really great time for B-tier shooters. Games that were easy to ignore at the time with such a glut of games like them, but often had some element that ended up turning them into a hidden gem as the years went on. And I definitely feel that way about Prey, a game I did enjoy at the time, but very quickly forgot in the flood of other titles, yet one that I would occasionally still remember fondly. Prey is a game that saw a lot of different versions over the years and spent a long time in development hell. I might call it a Duke Nukem Forever that turned out better, if I didn't think that still felt a little offensive towards Prey. The game was first announced in 1995, and going back through old video game magazines, you can find way more information about some of the different stabs that were taken over the years. The final one, the 2006 version I played through for this review, didn't really start development in earnest until 2001, though you can still see bits and pieces of those older versions in the final release. Something that was a core feature for a lot of those versions of the game were portals, and the final game does do some pretty incredible stuff with portals for the time. If this game had come out a little bit more on schedule, this stuff would have been truly mind-bending. But it's still important to remember this is still a world before Valve's Portal. So the fact that portals are scripted didn't detract from the novelty much. It plays with the placement of portals in moving objects, the idea that portals can take you to different scales, and the static, scripted nature of those portals does allow the game to do some really cool stuff that actually does still hold up. Now, the portals are absolutely the banner feature in Prey, but another mechanic I honestly found just as engaging, if not more so, was the gravity flipping. Scattered throughout levels are devices you can shoot that flip the gravity towards that device, and sometimes there are tons of surfaces with those on them, or that have walkways you can stick to, and so you start absolutely flipping around incredibly rapidly. And again, the scripted, pre-placed nature of those objects makes the experience a lot more controlled and lets them do some really neat level design that takes those into account. I'll happily admit that shooting enemies while upside down or sideways is a gimmick, but I'll be damned if it isn't a gimmick that I loved the whole time I was playing this game. Prey has another neat idea when it comes to how it handles death. Instead of just bumping you back to the last checkpoint when you die, the game puts you into the afterlife, where you shoot blue and red enemies, which determine your health and spirit levels on respawn. It's a cool idea, but it does make the game feel kinda easy on the default difficulty, even though there are occasional but inconsistent attempts made to make the minigame a little more difficult. Tied into that death is your ability to spirit walk, to leave your body and walk around to get through shields and shoot enemies stealthily. I pretty much only used it to grab ammo and solve the game's incredibly basic puzzles, however, and didn't find it particularly useful outside of that. It's yet another very neat idea this game has, but it's a little less fleshed out and interesting than either the portals or the gravity manipulation. While it wasn't new at the time, honestly, I'm also still a sucker for the whole Doom 3 screen interaction mechanic. It still feels so cool and futuristic even all these years later, and this game was already a few years after Doom 3 did it first. This game is based on id Tech 4, the same engine that powered Doom 3, and its influence can be felt outside the interactive screens as well. The whole game just kinda has that same feel, both graphically and in its environment design. It's not quite as aggressively dark, though, a fact the game's dialogue itself makes light of in a very groan-worthy in-joke reference to the progenitor of its engine. As a whole, the style of this game is really great. They lean heavily into that sort of organic technology being the main focus of this alien race that has abducted you, and it all feels like the requisite amount of just gross that you'd expect from that style of science fiction. Now, unfortunately, the game's shooting is pretty uninspiring as a whole, to the point where I barely have anything to say about it, except to note the dramatic lack of any responsiveness to your shots on the part of the enemies. But the style of the game overall, as well as the portal mechanics, more than make up for what is easily the most middling, uninteresting part of the entire package. Though it is still disappointing because it's a shooter. The best way I can think to describe it is just kind of lifeless, compared to what the rest of the game does successfully manage to pull off. The worst part of the package, though, is the voice acting.
The land of the...
All that Cherokee crap, it's a bunch of superstitious bullshit.
And that's a bummer, because you can definitely feel like they were trying with their story. The vast majority of the plot is moved forward in the opening cutscene and the afterlife you occasionally visit, the same place you go temporarily when you die, and the whole thing feels like a half-hearted, though not misguided attempt to make an alien invasion plot tie in with Cherokee oral tradition. It's disappointing because they even made an honest attempt here to be as faithful as they could, and even hired Native American voice actors for the main characters, at least one of whom had positive things to say about the developer's ability to take feedback and the working experience in an interview at the time with Games for Windows magazine. As an end product, however, it stumbles around a lot in what ends up being a pretty generic tale. The main character, his girlfriend, and his grandfather are all abducted into a giant spaceship, and the protagonist sets off to save his girlfriend and eventually the world. What really lets it down is the main character's wholly unlikable nature for most of the plot, and in particular his diegetic quips as you roam through the game's world, feeling incredibly out of place, as if they had transplanted Duke Nukem directly into this game.
Get the fuck away from me! Die! Die! Die!
In an interesting attempt at grounding the game, they also hired Art Bell, the late great host of the famous Coast to Coast AM radio show, to give the on-Earth perspective to what's going on while you run around up in this giant spaceship. How people on the ground are reacting within the sort of show that Art Bell was always running. And it really succeeds. It grounds what's going on in the modern world of this era the game came out in.
But for the first hour, we're going to open up the phone lines for your calls. If you have something on your mind,
A really neat touch, and scattered throughout the game. Not so much as to where there's too much of it, but just enough that you're constantly reminded of where you are, really close to Earth, even though there's all this alien stuff all around you. Now, I'd be remiss if we went a whole review of Prey without talking about its lost but not forgotten sequel. It's teased pretty heavily at the end of this game that there was a sequel coming, and by the time they actually started showing it off quite a few years later, there was a ton of hype around this game, and a demo that had been shown. But it was never to be, ultimately going through the same sort of cycles that this game did. Unlike Prey, however, its sequel would never come out, and the property was eventually sold off, its name being reused for the brilliant 2017 immersive sim, also called Prey, which has about one thing in common with this Prey: its first-person shooting nature. Perhaps as a result, this game has been completely abandoned over the years, and in order to play, you'll have to hunt down a copy, which is pretty easy. But on the other hand, getting this game's PC version running is a bit of a chore. This was never a very well-loved PC port to start with, and its limitations around resolutions feel even worse than they did at launch. Still, due to the ability to run at a higher resolution and frame rate, though the PC version is still capped at 60 FPS, I think it's the best way to experience the game these days. And as should be clear from the number of times I've praised this game's unique and neat ideas, I think it's a real shame that Prey has mostly faded into the past, and I think it's well worth taking a look at it today, especially in a gaming landscape with so few first-person shooter campaigns to play. It absolutely has its rough edges. It has a lot of them, and it feels like a game of its era in some of the worst possible ways. But it's a really great joy to play, and doesn't overstay its welcome at all.